And now, your feature presentation.
Welcome back to another Untitled movie review. I am one of your hosts, Matt Rohrbeck. Alongside, he's allergic to tomatoes, but he is tomato meter approved, Eric Marchin.
Matt, it's gonna be May.
Yeah, Mei Lee. Today we are reviewing Disney Pixar's Turning Red, directed by Domee Shi, and being released on March 11th on Disney Plus worldwide. Some theaters in certain countries if you don't have Disney Plus. But it is what is this? The fourth Pixar movie, third in a row that is going straight to Disney
So
Plus.
Luca, Soul, Onward had a limited
Yeah.
theatrical release, but that
So just this will be the third in a row, fourth if you include Onward, which went to Disney Plus pretty quickly after its theaters because it was shut down. So, which is an interesting thing to talk about. Well, maybe at sometime during this we will talk about that, but and what they plan on doing with Lightyear. But today we are reviewing Turning Red, which showcases Toronto in a Disney Pixar movie, which is pretty fantastic. I wore my CBC isn't really featured, but it was like a very Canadian thing that I could be wearing for this review.
you got to get as much CanCon as you can into this episode, so we are covered for the whole year.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric, how are you?
I'm good. I've been thinking a lot about this movie since watching it, and just what it means for Canadian audiences, specifically those who live in Ontario and live in Toronto, and to see Toronto represented in a mainstream animated movie on this level, and being one excited about it because, spoiler alert, it's a really good movie, but also being a little disappointed that it is going to streaming because I think it would look so beautiful on
Yeah,
a big screen, the same way that I, I think a lot of people felt cheated that Soul was a movie that would have been just a wonderful
with
experience to
that score and
watch.
everything. Yeah,
And this is very similar, where you're watching this movie, and you know talking to you after seeing the film, there are so many Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the screen moments where you see certain locations or the geography, which is so well detailed, in terms of Kensington Market and Chinatown and Dundas, and the streetcars and TTC in general, and just like like you look at New York, you look at LA, and you look at all these places that have been featured in so many films, whether they be live action or
yeah,
animated, and you become accustomed to it because they're so frequently used. Even when Toronto is when a production shoots in Toronto, it's always standing in for another place, whether it be Detroit or New York or Chicago. And, it's very rare that Toronto is Toronto. And Domee Shi's Bao, the short animated film in which he won the Oscar for, featured both San Francisco and Toronto in that as well, and also feels like this beautiful continuation of a story about coming of age, but also finding autonomy and being yourself. And this is specifically also focused on the parent child relationship and the child becoming a teenager and hitting puberty. And that's another thing that we will be talking
yeah.
quite a bit about, is that Pixar hits puberty. This is a literal period piece
It
taking
literally is. Yeah,
place in 2002, but it actually has the conversation of what the body goes through, and what
during puberty. Yeah,
yes, and for
for
young
young
girls,
women. Yeah,
and becoming women. And yeah, the metaphor is there with this plot of this history of this family being cursed with coming of age, and when they come of age they turn into a red panda, and what you have to do in order to um, reverse the curse or trap it within sort of a totem. That is obviously a metaphor for puberty,
yeah.
and figuring out what your body is doing, and feeling different urges, and going through something. But on top of that, it's still having a literal conversation that I think is a better starting point than some sex ed classes that
Absolutely,
that we
yeah.
got when we were in middle school, which, the her school is Lester B. Pearson Middle School as well, which is again another, real school in Toronto. So yeah, watching this movie and looking at it from the point of view of a mother-daughter dynamic, you have May, who's voiced by Rosalie Chiang, and Sandra Oh, who again, you know when you think of great Canadian actors, is playing the mother, the matriarch of the family, and you're looking specifically at this Chinese Canadian family and sort of them, you know taking care of this temple, but also trying to navigate what it's like to be a teenager or becoming a teenager. And then even the stakes with the plot, it's not about life or death or the world ending. It's about
Going to
going
a
to
boy
a
band.
concert,
Yeah.
and
Four Town, baby.
and also I think really finding a core group of friends that
Yes.
you are truly, you can be yourself, and you can also figure
A
out who you're
support group
becoming.
almost,
Yeah.
yeah, and the people who pick you up and push you to get through these things. And yeah, I'm totally with you. This review will be heavily Toronto focused, and Toronto people will be obnoxious about this movie in a good way, I think, in the sense of like what Eric said is like, not since probably Scott Pilgrim have we gotten a film on this level that showcases Toronto as Toronto. And that's going to be really cool for people in this area. Like, and seeing it from such a major studio like Disney and Pixar, that is showcasing this city in such an authentic way, authentically in the early 2000s, authentic to today. Like, it's just such a wonderful, not only a love letter to this city, but such a wonderful coming of age kind of the Pixar way, which is what I tweeted, which is like, they've tackled emotions obviously in Inside Out. Is that what? Yeah, Inside
Yeah.
Out.
Well, even
They've
Soul,
tackled
right?
and Soul, they've tackled all that kind of stuff before. But I think, and something you brought up, Eric, and we've been talking about it, it's such an individual look at, becoming a young woman and going through puberty, that like, and discovering femininity and friendship and family. And I just thought it was such a wonderful look at all of that. And yeah, there are surprising things where you can't believe, I'm like, oh, they're talking about her getting her period, which I don't
You
even think you
see
really see.
tampons. You
Yeah,
see,
which
like, it's
in
a
an unheard of in an animated movie, let alone just in movies about young women in general. That is just like, that was shocking in like the most wonderful way of just going like, holy shit, okay, like that is so great that they're talking about these things. And yes, the metaphor is, overt and it is, about puberty and all those things. But I mean, I think it works in the context of this movie. It has that fantastical kind of fun thing that a Pixar movie usually has, where, it's true to life, but there's always an element that's kind of interesting and as in a metaphor or something like that, where I think, this is pretty obvious and in your face, but I think it's just such a wonderful way to kind of showcase that in a way that is for that thing we talk about during our Soul review or any Pixar movie, of that balance of being for people that are May's age, but also being for the adults, whether it's a relationship with the mother or just for everyone. And they're the best at doing this kind of thing. And especially when they get to be creative and do original things like this, that it's that fine line of making this fun for kids. So you put a fuzzy, big, cute red panda that's causing havoc around the city of Toronto. So if you have very young kids, a lot of the puberty stuff's going to go over their head, but you still have a fuzzy, a colorful movie that's just like a blast to watch. The boy band music is great from Four Town, and like,
which is
it's
done
like,
by Billie Eilish and
and
Phineas, right?
Phineas,
So, and
yeah,
it's completely
and
different from what they've done
oh
before.
yeah, but you can tell that they grew up with that kind of stuff, right? And like, this feels so authentically like early 2000s, that it's just like, again, we talked about the After Party recently, and that Eric and I were about the same age as the people who are going to the high school reunion, and that we were also about the same age as May is, in like maybe a little bit older than her in the early 2000s, but about the same. No, like, it's like
Yeah.
2003 and she's 13, right?
Yeah.
So we were about the same age as May. So like, even as young men, like, I feel like there's still a lot to kind of see in growing up and seeing the city, and we lived in the GTA, but you would come into Toronto pretty frequently, and I remember that being a big deal, taking the GO train into the city, and like falling in love with this city when I was probably about May's age, and roaming around, whether it's with my uncle Mark or my mom or my dad when they would go to Blue Jays games or at the Sky Dome, which is heavily featured in this movie. And
Just seeing
like all
Rogers
these,
get a credit at the
yeah,
end was
it's
just
very
bizarre.
weird. It's very weird, right? And then like just seeing that Skydome logo and like the love put into that, and the CN Tower and the TTC, like all that kind of stuff is just so fantastic. And then on top of that, you just have this wonderful coming of age story that is simple, but because it breaks ground of talking about a lot of these things that you don't really get in animated movies or in coming of age movies, maybe some more adult ones that handle this kind of stuff, but
Not as mainstream
and
either, right?
yeah,
Like, this is such a
exactly.
mainstream animated movie that the frankness in the discussion, on top of the metaphor, was so refreshing and really something that, again, like, it needs to be talked about more, because I feel like a movie like this will really help kids know that, like, everybody goes through this. You're not, transforming into some sort of monster or weird thing. Like, there's a body horror element to the storytelling as well, which is also very Cronenbergian, which is also very Canadian. So, um, yeah, it embraces so much about Canadian culture, but the human body, about what it means to become a teenager, what it means to be a young female, what it means to be interested in the opposite sex or the same
Yeah.
sex. And this movie is unabashedly very horny at times, in the sense that you
Yeah.
become infatuated by
With
somebody
this
else,
boy
and
band,
and
yeah.
and and you have these
And other
weird
boys around, yeah.
feelings inside that you can't really describe, that are almost like primal. And it's basically saying, like, these are all very normal things, and you
You
know
can
what?
like the guy at the Daisy Mart, and like
Yeah.
it's like, and that
God.
might be weird, but like it's a normal thing.
But it's also a very weird movie, because, like,
Yeah.
it's fun that the characters are so, eccentric and individually kind of, created. The group of her friends with Miriam and
Mhm.
Priya and Abby,
Such a
like, they're,
great group, yeah.
yeah. And I even love that the way that they kind of take this weird sort of approach to cultural appropriation and use it to their advantage as entrepreneurs, and sort of
Yeah.
make money off of,
Her
hugging and
becoming this
touching and taking
panda, yeah.
photos of the panda, and they use the money towards tickets for this concert coming up. And, like, that's even really smart and interesting in how that's kind of portrayed. And again, like, it does get to some moments, I think, in that last act, that are on par with a couple scenes in Petite Mama, where you're watching the relationship between the mother and the daughter in this, and how they come to relate to each other and understand each other in a way. Because May is very much somebody that wants to, she's a people pleaser. She wants to make her parents happy, and that's another thing that it really does it go into, specifically culturally speaking, is that it looks at how, you know kids in certain families always have to appease their parents, or they feel
Mhm.
that there's this.
Different traditions and different ways of
Exactly.
being brought up, yeah. And I thought that was, being a she's a Chinese Canadian in this movie, and I thought that, like, even that was handled in, like, talking to I watched this with Nevis, and, her parents immigrating from Croatia, obviously much different, but you kinda it's those universal kinda things you see in this kinda stuff, and I thought that was just wonderful, and, like, even the generational difference about growing up and dealing with these things, right? Like, we won't go too much into it, but, like, I think it tackles that in a really interesting way of how your grandparents interacted with your mother, and how your mother interacts with you, and how you will interact with your kids, right? And like, you get a little bit more, I don't want to use the word tolerant, but like, you get a little bit more accepting and understand, because each generation goes through it in a very different way and then handles it in a very different way. And I think the movie tackles that wonderfully as well, like in that last act that you're talking about, that I think, like, that is, if you think the metaphor of the red panda is overt, like, or maybe a little too obvious or anything like that, like, it's a kids movie, one, but I think as it goes along and you see how they develop that with the generations, like, I think that's actually a really interesting way of, like, using the red panda as that metaphor of puberty, or the multitude of things in this movie, but how each generation deals with that, I think, is like a really cool way of tackling that too. And yeah, all the Toronto Easter eggs, like I don't want to give them all away, but like some are obvious and you've seen in trailers like Skydome and things like that. But the Daisy Mart is hilarious, and they couldn't use the name Much Music because it seems like maybe Rogers giving them the Skydome thing, maybe Bell couldn't give them the rights to Much Music or something like that, but there's a nod to Much Music in there. Like there's so many little things for if you are from the city. And Eric mentioned like it's so accurate with the actual like geography of things that like even in something like What If or the F Word or Scott Pilgrim to an
Enemy.
extent, which is like an Enemy, and
Yeah.
like Enemy does a pretty good job, but there are times where you're like, that doesn't
Queen
make
Street
sense.
video
like,
is
yeah,
one thing.
right. Or like if you watch something like Christmas Chronicles, and even though that's not supposed to be Toronto, it's shot here and is distracting if you're from here because you're like, wait a minute, those streets don't attach at all.
Or that
He's
horrible Denny Arcade movie, An Eye for Beauty, where they start
Sure.
at Bay and Bloor, and then all of a sudden, like they're biking, like the next shot, they're already at the harbor front.
Yeah,
And you're
and
just
stuff like that is stupid, and only people who live here will notice that stuff. And like, but this just does such a great job of like, yeah, like Eric already mentioned, like you see Kensington Market, which goes right into Chinatown, and then you kind of see the different areas of the city, and they drop the TTC's name, and the streetcars look so accurate, and like the people in the city in the background look super accurate, and it's just like it's just so much fun. And then the Four Town stuff, like if you grew up in the early 2000s as well, like we mentioned I think Joey Noel, who was on a recent review we did, another Disney thing,
a very different Disney thing.
Very different, about a different time in your life when you're dating and things like that. Joey joined me for the Fresh review. Go check that out. But she mentioned the Four Town, and then it brought up, and Eric and I were talking too, of that it seems like it's a combination of O Town and B44. Right? Is that
Yes,
what
yeah.
B44? Yeah.
So, and both of
And
those bands have songs that are sexual innuendo songs.
yeah.
So, uh, basically, Before Four has "If You Get Down on Me, I'll Get Down on You,"
Yeah.
and then
Liquid Dreams.
Liquid Dreams.
It's like,
Yeah,
it's so funny. And like if you think about all the boy bands from back then, or even the Spice Girls, if you go into
back
that
then,
territory, like
Backstreet's
yeah,
back.
yeah.
Alright.
And like they were the horniest songs, right? That were always
Oh, yeah.
about things that almost went way over our heads as kids, but like
And
kids were the ones
adults
that
looking
were.
at it as like, this is like lewd,
Yeah,
and
and then but we're singing it not even really knowing what it's about, and I think they really capture that with Four Town. And like it's not as lewd obviously as some of those songs are, not as like descriptive in the way that like they talk about their tummies and stuff in the song, which I think was really funny. And like I forget what the one lyric, but you guys can listen to it on streaming. And
but it's
but
still very much
it's
playing
very
in the
catchy,
same
and yeah,
ballpark as a lot of these boy and girl bands of the late
great jokes
90s.
about them too. Like
And I
there's some
keep making
great
the
stuff
joke that there would be like this weird version of putting the two together, but Turning Red and Red Rocket. But Red Rocket also kind of is an interesting connection with just how it uses the early 2000s in terms of the not just the aesthetic, but as the main character's interior life, and how that character in Red Rocket kind of grew up, or not grew up, but was kind of most popular at that period of time, and using the NSYNC song in that movie with Bye Bye Bye, and then kind of advertising this with Backstreet Boys, and again, mentioning O Town and Before Four and all these
and
bands
sync.
that came out at around the same time. And it was like the peak of that era of boy band music, because it almost seems to happen like at the end of every decade, where like in the late 80s you had the New Kids on the Block and Menudo and things like that were really popular at that particular time in like 1987 to 1990 or 1991. And then grunge kind of came in and kind of swept that all under the rug with the hair metal bands. And then about like 95, 96, you started seeing the boy band resurgence come back again. And then into the early 2000s, you also had like, the sort of like the hybrid rock metal stuff coming in and kind of trying to clear that out with like everything from Limp Bizkit to Linkin Park, and then even Eminem kind of making
Mhm.
kind of poking fun at a lot of these artists. And now there seems to kind of be a greater appreciation from the generation that grew up with it, the same way that the generation that grew up with their favorite boy bands or what have you are now enjoying that more, in maybe a less ironic way, and just as like, oh, this music was more enjoyable than I thought it was.
Yeah, I was rocking some B44, and like I've been listening to the
Frosted Tips.
yeah, it's awesome. Shout out to Tamagotchis. Shout out to like just some of the tech and different things of that time period is just so it's nostalgic, and just like I said, this movie just felt like a warm hug because it felt like it still tackled some really important stuff that you just don't see in movies like this very often, and I just felt like it was just at a time like this, and especially being from Toronto, which obviously will give this movie a little bit of a boost for people that are in this area. And then Eric, we can talk a little bit about what you said of feeling like this is the first time that, not maybe the first time, but like an individual made a Pixar movie. You mentioned that, which I thought was an interesting point.
Yeah, so I really do feel that, like, with Domee Shi and Julia Cho, who are Domee Shi directed it and co-wrote it with Julia Cho, like it kind of feels like it's more of a singular vision than a group of like, obviously it's still very much a
A whole
collaborative
team, yeah.
effort. But I always remembered as a kid, after Toy Story came out, there would always be these trailers for the next Pixar movie, especially when you got to films like Ratatouille and Wall-E, where it would be like, oh, like Andrew Stanton and I, or Brad Bird and I were in a restaurant 10 years ago talking about the initial concept of this, and this is how it kind of grew out of that. Where with this, it almost feels like these two filmmakers, you know Domee Shi is actually somebody that has been working at Pixar, and in storyboarding and animation and things like that, but it kind of feels like they brought this to the table instead of it being developed on the table. And I also think, like, obviously a part of it will be the sort of mixing of the anime style that's also in here. There's a lot of stuff that is paying homage to Dragon Ball Z and Sailor
Mhm.
Moon and all this kind of stuff, so that will also be something that people will notice, that it's a little bit different from a Pixar movie. But like, if you didn't see the Pixar logo, it could be easy to confuse this movie with something that like Lord and Miller are doing
Yeah, it
over at
reminded me a
Sony.
lot of Mitchell's versus the Machines. Even like I think Katie Mitchell would be friends with May, and like yeah, that's what caught me off guard was the animation style of like I'm like, remember when we brought up that it seemed like Sony finally found their voice when it came to animation with the Lord and Miller stuff, with the kind of mix of hand drawn and CG and things like that. And you can kind of, not saying that they were influenced by those like Spider-Verse and Mitchell's versus the Machines, because this would have been made probably at the same time as Mitchell's versus the Machines,
Well,
but
Domee, she
um
did say that, like, she like, because I watched the press
anime and
conference,
stuff.
that
Yeah,
the
I was there
anime
too. Yeah.
specifically for
Yeah.
like Sailor Moon, which makes sense because like there are things in there that, like, if you watched anime, I mean, at any time, but specifically in the late 90s, early 2000s, certain expressions, especially when it comes to like embarrassment or awkwardness, were like
Yes.
the
Is
single
very much
sweat
out of
kind of,
that. Yeah.
yeah. So it gets that perfectly. And
Yeah,
it's, and
totally.
it melds well together. Like, it
It
doesn't
does, it
feel
just didn't
disjointed in
feel,
any way.
but you haven't seen that in a Pixar movie, right? And
No.
to your point, it was more in Spider-Verse and Mitchell's versus the Machines. So, like, I really think that's interesting that Pixar is able, you'd think that they're such a machine, like you're talking about, that it's just like, we know how to make people cry or feel an emotion, or we have this down to a science of how we can make these really, really great animated films. And they all kind of look gorgeous but similar, even though very unique depending on what the property is or what they're talking about. But like, this was the first time where I'm like, oh damn, like you get some hand-drawn stuff in there, you get some of those anime influences, like they're being a little bit more playful with the animation, which I think is really interesting. And I do think that that is a testament to Sony kind of pushing them a little bit, because I feel like they were, on their own level, like no one could really touch them. The only things that were other Disney stuff that was from just Disney animation proper. So now you have someone coming in and doing something, a style that feels completely unique, and you're seeing some of those influences, whether they come from the anime or they kind of go, "Ooh, Spider-Verse was cool." that beat us at the Oscars. So, or Mitchell's versus the Machines this year. So, yeah, or last year.
And it represents the character so
Yeah.
well because it's messy and awkward and tonally just at times is this weird sort of like it can be comedic, but it can also be dramatic. And I think it reflects who May is as a person. And I think that that's really important that it's coming from somebody internally, externalizing those feelings and, talking about them and also going through them and you're experiencing the world from this character's point of view. And yeah, obviously, something like Inside Out had some experimental moments in that movie, but this really does almost feel like Pixar like bought this instead of like, made it in-house. Like it's just so unique and richly defined by character more so than even plot, which Pixar is very good, as you mentioned, with kind of almost like that assembly line, kind of putting things together, kind of building algorithms that they know will kind of hit and when and work, and they've done that for decades now. But this does feel like Pixar really went outside of their own comfort zone and did something truly special and just hard to kind of say that like this like it's just its own thing, and that's kind of what I love about it.
Yeah, and I've sat on it and even become more higher even talking about it, because I think if I was gonna criticize the movie at all, I think right when it ended, I was like, "That was really cute." I loved a lot of the stuff that they tackled. I love the Toronto stuff. Did it To me, I'm like, was it top tier Pixar? And I think after talking about it with you and thinking about it we saw it over a week and a half ago, that I think it's in the conversation of that upper tier. I don't know if I ever got hit on an emotional level, to the point of some other Pixar movies that have really kind of connected with me emotionally. Maybe that's because I'm a 33-year-old man, and this movie's not necessarily about me, or even, I said there's some universal themes, and I think that it's very important for young women and young girls watching this and things like that.
Well,
Maybe
women
that
of
played into
color
it.
as well,
Yeah,
right?
women of color being about a Chinese Canadian. Like, so maybe that's why it didn't hit on that level, and I hope it does for a ton of people. Um, I think when it finished, I was like, you know what, 4 out of 5, thought it was really good. But it didn't necessarily hit that like upper tier amazing Pixar level. But then after thinking about it and talking about it with you, like, I do think that it is special. And I think, does that get a little bit of a bump because we're from Toronto? I think a little bit, but like, I think people from other cities that have either never been here or have no connection to the city, none of that stuff's gonna really do anything for them, right?
I don't know. I think there is something to say about seeing
A
a
different city.
landscape that is different from what you're used to, because mentioning at the beginning of the review, you've seen LA, New York, London, a lot of
Totally.
these landmarks used in animated or live action in general that are so familiar that it's nice to see something different. And even though Toronto is a major metropolitan and like it's like it's like any other city, and obviously it has stood in for all those other places that I've mentioned in the past, maybe with the exception of London, but it's just nice to see something that truly is embracing what it means to be Canadian,
Totally.
and
Totally, dude.
what it means also to be Canadian in the sense of a melting pot
Yeah.
and to be diverse and
Multicultural. Yeah.
multicultural. Yeah, like it's that, like that's why this movie I think is so, it's just such a unique experience. And like again, like it's hard to kind of like like I almost feel it's like weird to classify it as a Pixar film because it
No, I
almost
know,
feels
but
like
I
it's
mean, it's
outside
natural
of
though
that.
too,
Yeah.
right? But I think that is natural, and like, uh, because it is from that studio, and even if it does feel completely different. But yeah, I agree with you that, like, New York has its vibe for its culture and people that it showcases, right? And I hope this starts something with a Toronto as a location that has its own vibe of being that melting pot and that multicultural kind of city, because I think this movie does a great job without like hamming that and shoving it in your face. Like, it's just a part of it, right? Like, it's
Yeah.
just what it is.
And
And
even
like,
when it does, it makes sense because like when May shows her TTC card and shows that like I'm an adult now because the
Yeah.
TTC says that, 13
I'm
to
13. Yeah.
65,
Yeah.
like it makes sense that this would be in your face because she's kind of going through. But yeah, it doesn't really necessarily drop like every 5 minutes, like, oh, here's like a couple toonies or loonies, or like I'm going to Tim Hortons. It's there,
Yeah.
but it's in
And
the
it's for the people.
details.
Yeah. And it's for the people who are from here, which will see the Timbits on the table. We'll see that kind of stuff. Right. Like, yeah. And we're going to love that kind of stuff. But it is a great movie, and it is unfortunate it's not playing in theaters, because I think it would have been great in cinemas. I get why they're doing it. I'm so glad it's getting a Toronto premiere at TIFF Bell Lightbox, like on International Women's Day. I think is great. I would have loved to go do that, but just with everything going on, I thought about being like, oh, I really would love to see this on the big screen. But um, yeah, man, it is a great movie. I'm gonna give it a 4.5. I'm bumping it up. I originally went with a 4 after I saw it, but after talking about it and thinking about it, maybe it's the Toronto half-star bump. But I think it is a great movie. I'm gonna give it a 4.5.
Yeah, I'm also going to give it a 4.5. I could see myself giving it a 5 by the end of the
Yeah,
year. It's just like part of me is as well as like thinking like, okay, do I have to like look at it from a point of view of bias, because it, you mentioned
totally.
it, where it's like, there are things that are pandering to me or red pandaing to me, but it it hey, it's late. So, but I really did feel that it was in the details that it really paid attention to, again, just the geography and the landscape, but also still had the heart of telling a really wonderful story that didn't like, Soul was an amazing experience and one that was really moving, but I feel with Luca and some of their other stuff more recently, it's been kind of almost like the kind of Pixar you just expect.
Yeah.
Like the kind of like, oh, we're just doing this to kind of like fill a quota. And not to say that those movies don't have worthwhile moments or could move people in ways that kind of, speak to them, even with Onwards.
Oh, totally.
It just kind of felt like there was this wane where, Pixar started as this company that was like, okay, we're telling original fresh stories and we won't really do sequels, and then Toy Story 2 comes up, but Toy Story 2 is a great movie. And then it's still like, okay, we're doing stuff that like people can remember from their childhood that both adults and kids can enjoy, Monsters Inc., Wall-E, Ratatouille, the exception of the car movies, which truly are for children. And it just at some point there it felt like they just kind of like lost track a little bit. And
I think it's just they became so popular. It's the same thing with Marvel and Star Wars with Disney after they bought them, right? You're instead of doing one movie every couple years, you're now doing 2 movies a year. So that means you're hiring more people, which means your teams are more spread out, and like your ideas. I'm not saying the ideas are watered down or anything, but like I think when you had everyone focused on, one movie, or maybe 2 teams doing alternate, movies or things like that, or I don't know. I'm just not saying that's exactly how it worked, because who knows? I don't work at Pixar, but
right.
um,
But this
but
doesn't feel like that because, like, again, like you
no,
almost had this rotation initially where it was like, okay, we're gonna have Andrew Stanton direct something, and if he's not directing
yeah,
something,
Brad
we're gonna have
Bird
Brad
or
Bird,
or
and then
John
Pete Docter,
Lasseter,
and
yeah.
then John Lasseter, and those were like all the guys. So it's like if one of them wasn't in development on a movie, it would be the other
Yeah.
one, and they're all
Yeah.
white guys
And they
doing their
rotated,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, with the exception of John Lasseter, like there seem to be like decent people and what have you, but
Sure, yeah.
bringing in, and this is only the second Pixar movie, the first solo one to be directed by a woman, which is kind of surprising.
Mhm.
So, and with all the complications with what happened with Brave as well, so like it's almost like they should be bringing in more people or moving up people that
Totally.
have been working there for a long time, because
That have
obviously,
unique visions and stuff like
yeah,
that,
and
yeah.
you saw that with Bao, and
Different
Bao was
perspectives and
such a
yeah.
beautiful short that it's like I almost wish that that was like a feature as well, but it's almost like you're getting that as this,
Mhm.
companion piece.
Mm-hmm.
to that. And so I hope Domee continues to make
Oh yeah,
original movies, because she does feel like a singular voice. But also I hope that Pixar, is looking for great stories to tell from people that maybe don't have their stories shown every day.
I totally agree. And next up, I mean, on the other side of things, we have Lightyear coming, which looks to be their return to cinemas, which is a good thing. I just wish it was for this movie.
Yeah.
The one thing I learned yesterday in a little bit of research is that Lightyear, I think it will. Lightyear seems like it is going to cinemas because, again, I think it's an established franchise. It'll make them a ton of money. It is something different for them, even if it looks derivative of action blockbusters that we've gotten over the last 10 years or so, or even longer. But they're actually making some of the footage in 1:4:3 IMAX aspect ratio, which I didn't know, and it's the first animated movie to ever do that, like have scenes in IMAX for like an IMAX aspect ratio. So I thought that was really, really interesting. So to see Pixar play with something like that, where it's not technically shot in IMAX because it's all made on a computer, but they're upping the aspect ratio for IMAX screenings of Lightyear, and I can't wait to see what that looks like to fill up that whole IMAX screen. But yeah, we have Lightyear coming, and then after that, do we know what Pixar is doing? Yeah, Turning Red is coming, then Lightyear, and then 3 Untitled films uh in 2023, 24, and 2 in 2024. So we don't know what those are yet. So at least
You'll
from
probably get an announcement around the time that Lightyear's coming out, because they were also working on that show as well that was going to be on Disney Plus. That was going to be
yes, they
like,
have a bunch of shows coming on Disney Plus, I think, right?
yeah, but there was that one where it was like each episode was the same day but from a different point of view.
Yeah, that was interesting too. Or wasn't it about like, yeah, that did sound really, really interesting. And one thing we didn't talk about is Ludwig Göransson's score too, which is
Yeah,
an interesting guy to bring in. And I thought his score, he crushed it as well.
he's
Thought it was really,
everywhere
really
right
good.
now.
He really is. He's one of those guys like Giacchino. You would have thought Giacchino would have jumped in here, but he's doing Lightyear. So,
Yeah.
and then on the TV front for Pixar, before we kick out of here, because I am curious of what you were talking about, upcoming films, feature films, and shorts. Where's their TV part? I guess they don't even have it on Wikipedia yet because of it being so new. Anyway, Turning Red's great. If you're in a country where you can see it in a cinema, I would definitely say go do that, because I think it would be wonderful. I really hope we get the chance. I hope like somewhere like a Lightbox or somewhere else does like a program soon where it's like a bunch of movies that you weren't able to see in cinemas. I know they kind of did that for some of the pandemic days, but oh, here it is. So we have Doug Days, which was already on Disney Plus. Cars on the Road is coming this year with Mater and Lightning McQueen. And then the other show is called Win or Lose,
That
which will
I think that
follow
was it.
middle school softball team the week leading up to the big championship game, where each episode will be from a different perspective. So sort of like the after party we just
Or
talked
Yellow
about.
Jackets.
So, or yeah. Yeah, might be like Yellow Jackets. Thank you all for listening or watching. We really, really do appreciate it. As I mentioned, we have some other reviews we would love for you guys to check out. You can check out our spoiler-free review of the Batman on this channel, Untitled Movie Reviews, where Eric and I, for about 40 minutes or more, or maybe an hour, talk about the Batman in with no spoilers. So go check that out. If you've seen the movie already and want kind of like an hour and a half of people talking about all the nitty gritty details in full spoiler form, we have a spoiler cast, which is over on our main channel. We also did an after party spoiler cast, which you can check out on that channel. And there is, if you want more Disney Plus content, if you're in Canada, Fresh is now streaming. Don't watch that with your kids, but you can check that out, and then go listen to the review or watch the review with Joey Noel. She jumped in for Eric, and we reviewed that over on Untitled Movie Reviews. One-stop shop. Just head over to Letterboxd, Untitled_movies. Everything's over there for you guys. Probably the easiest spot to get everything. And as always, my name is Matt Rohrbeck. You can find more of my work around the internet, but mostly at UntitledMoviePodcast.com. And you can follow me on all those social medias at Matt Rohrbeck.
And I'm Eric Marching. You can find more of my video reviews on rogerstv.com/cinemascene and on the social medias at EM6211.
Until next time.
Quit playing games with my heart, my heart, my heart.